Hello friends, I'm Samuel. Thank you for your responses to the first video. It was really encouraging. Today I'd like to delve into some detail and address some common misinformation about autism, which might have informed the decision made by the Army forbidding autistic people to enlist. We're going to start with the government's autism strategy, which despite only being written in 2021, appears to be at best woefully out of date and at worst lacking in some serious analysis of basic statistics and general fact checking. And it's so bad that this whole video is essentially on just page 8. So the first point I'd like to make is that autism is probably a lot more common than you think. The National Autistic Society gives the approximate figure of 700,000 autistic people, roughly 1% of the country. This is the figure used by the government's autism strategy, but this is based on decades of underdiagnosis, and I would make the argument that the actual number is significantly higher. Until fairly recently, the focus on diagnosis has been on boys and men, as the initial study groups conducted by Hunter Burgess were all male, and he therefore made the erroneous claim that all autistic people must be male because he didn't know how studying things worked. He was a very bad scientist, which makes sense because he also kind of worked with the Nazis. Anyway, moving on, that's a side point. But this became so prevalent in the scientific community's understanding that it wasn't until 1992 that the idea of autistic women was taken seriously by the scientific community. And it was not even until 2005 that it was suggested that the criteria should be changed to allow for differences of biological sex. When the DSM-5, which is like the encyclopedia of mental conditions, came out in 2013, it was criticized on the basis that it did not describe female autistic traits, and the tests used remain focused on stereotypical male autistic traits. The idea that autism is inherently male has persisted in the biases of social workers and consultants, which is not helped by it presenting more subtly in women, which has left many women underdiagnosed or being misdiagnosed with very different conditions like depression and anxiety or broader communication or personality disorders. There is also a bias in diagnosis when it comes to ethnic minorities. While it is true that the criteria itself does not exclude people from different racial groups, nevertheless, in the US, studies have suggested that black children are less likely to be detected than white children due to biases in specialist clinics, lack of recommendations from schools, and wider issues of structural racism, including lower awareness of autism in minority communities. Last year, UCL published a study in the UK that found that the stat used by Autistic Society, and therefore the government's 2021 autistic strategy of 1%, is probably a gross underestimate based on old criteria before 2011. Instead, the high rate of underdiagnosis in older groups, an estimated 150,000 people to 500,000 people aged 20 to 49 and 250,000 to 600,000 people aged over 50 means that autistic people make up between 1 and 3% of the total population. The median of these estimates equates to 1.2 million autistic people in Britain, close to double the government's official figures. As most adults are undiagnosed, I can all but guarantee that the Army currently has some serving autistic soldiers. And considering the Army is the smallest it's been in 200 years, they have always had autistic people serving as volunteers and as conscripts. They just didn't have a formal diagnosis. Another crucial point to make is that autism is not a learning disability, and while there is a high comorbidity between the two, it's often exaggerated. The government's autism strategy quotes Autistica as saying that 4 in 10 autistic people have learning difficulties. Except when you click on the hyperlink in the document, it does not say this. Autistica says 1 in 3, 33%, not 40%. But even these figures are inaccurate, as when you account for age, only 12% of autistic people under the age of 19 have a learning difficulty, where autistic people aged 50 to 49 are 40% likely to have a learning difficulty. Autism does not degrade the mind with age. This is the result purely of heavy underdiagnosis in older populations. So, the actual proportion of autistic people with learning difficulties is around 1 in 10, not 4 in 10. So either the government made a large mistake in the introduction of its strategy, or it's already incredibly out of date in some very basic information it needs to be able to fulfill its goals. Additionally, as we've already said, autism is heavily underdiagnosed across age, gender, and race. And the people who are diagnosed are going to have less subtle symptoms, and learning difficulties are more noticeable, and therefore more likely to be diagnosed. In my opinion, this has become a diagnostic chicken and egg situation, as kids with learning difficulties are assessed for autism more than people without learning difficulties and are 26 times more likely to be diagnosed. The result is a form of survivorship bias, which is a statistics problem where attention is only paid to a certain point of data that's already been through a selection process. The best example of this is in the Second World War, where the US were trying to figure out where they should put armor inside the planes, using data of where the bullet holes in returning bombers were. But this did not account for the fact that the most damaged bombers did not return. And instead of putting armor where the holes were, they should put it around the engines where there were no holes. The comorbidity is as high as it is because social workers and specialists are looking for autism in planes they can see, with bullet holes in the fuselage, not in the planes that didn't make it back. The point I'm making is that the vast majority of autistic people do not have learning difficulties, despite the common schemas that exist in our society. As such, people and organizations are likely to view autistic people as more incapable than they are. There are so many stereotypes of autism and exaggerations of traits that have infected our cultural understandings. I have heard anecdotal story one after the other about GPs saying that somebody could not be autistic because they're in our relationships or had friends or could look somebody in the eye for a short period of time. The thing is, guys, autism is genetic. So if the doctors are saying you can't be autistic because you can be in a relationship, I don't think they understand the very basics of how it works. And these are people who are meant to be the first line in referring people to specialists. So while it is outrageous and lazy for the army to have a blanket ban on employment and to not even allow a formal interview on the partial basis that 40% of those it applies to may have a learning difficulty and therefore poor communication, it's even more absurd when the actual figures are 12% and possibly lower. I can nevertheless understand how this ban is the result of widespread societal ignorance, not malice. I doubt that the army actually has autism specialists. The government's autism strategy seems to be incredibly out of date for a document that is only 3 years old. And this will be partly explained by new research, but it may also reflect a lack of understanding in the Department of Health and Social Care. Broadly, the strategy is positive with its heart in the right place, but it cannot be effective if its basic data is so inaccurate. Okay, that was a lot of stats and numbers, so we're going to end the video here. I'm already working on more videos on this, where we will look at some broader misconceptions about autism, including social communication. We will also look at poor representation in society and the economic problems faced by autistic people. I thank you for watching, and I hope to see you guys again.